What's going on, everybody? My name is Sage, and today I wanted to bring you the second video in my series going over the covenants for the Feral Druid. The covenant I'm going to go over today is the Malddraxxus covenant, or the NecroLords. Before we get into the Malddraxxus specific content for the Feral Druid and how it changes and why you should or shouldn't pick this covenant, all of the deep dive information that I went over, the talents, the legendaries, and all of the conduits will be referred to in this video. However, I did go over them in depth inside the Night Fae video, so I will be posting the link to that video as well as showing the timestamps in that video so you can refer back to it. This is so that we don't have to make this video exponentially long going over information that we've already given out. I will refer back to all of that information as needed, but I don't want to get in as specific as I did inside that Night Fae Feral Druid video to make this video, one, shorter, but two, just more informative about what has changed from those details going into the Malddraxxus covenant. Alright, so the Malddraxxus, NecroLord, Feral Druid, the two big abilities that it has, we're going to go briefly over them, and I'm going to go into detail of them later on and their synergies that they have with certain abilities. But before we go into the soulbinds and the conduits that affect them, we need to know what these abilities are, because these soulbinds heavily reflect on what you have for these two abilities. So the very first one is going to be the main ability that you get, which is called an Adaptive Swarm. It costs 500 mana. It has a 43-yard range. It's instant. Command a swarm that heals for 1,911 or deals 1,820 shadow damage over 12 seconds to a target, and increases the effectiveness of your periodic effects on them by 20%. Upon expiration, jumps to a target within 25 yards, alternating between friend and foe up to 3 times. All right. So very quickly, we're going to go over the ability that everybody from a NecroLord gets, which is called Fleshcraft. It's channeled. It's a 2-minute cooldown. Form a shield of flesh and bone over 4 seconds that absorbs damage equal to 20% of your maximum health for 2 minutes. Channeling near a corpse claims their essence to grow the shield up to 50% of your maximum health. This is most effective against powerful enemies. So now that we know just what those tooltips say, we will go into further synergies, but I wanted to make sure everybody knew what those abilities were going into these soulbinds because they're heavily reliant on them. So the first things I want to go over is going to be the Covenant-specific Conduit, and then we're going to go into each of the soulbinds and all the soulbind powers that each of them have, just like we did in the previous video. The NecroLords are only going to have one unique special conduit that you get that's going to change your main ability, Adaptive Swarm, and that's called Evolved Swarm. It's a potency conduit. That Adaptive Swarm increases the periodic effects by an additional 6%. So it already has the base 20%. This brings it up to 26%, and Evolved Swarm will eventually have its ranks that get increased even further beyond that as we progress through the expansion. Now, one of the things that I wanted to go over real quickly is that Adaptive Swarm is a strictly single target ability. It does have the ability to jump on its third leap to a secondary target that you might have bleeds on, so it might amplify those bleeds, but mainly it is a purely single target ability that you can control. Everything outside of that is out of your control for when you place it on the target. Having it jump from your target to a friendly player and then back to your target depends on variables that we will discuss here. But before we discuss that, I want to go into the soulbinds themselves. All of the other conduits besides the one specific to Malddraxxus we went over in depth inside the Night Fae video. If you would like to hear more about those specifically, please refer back to that video. Alright, so now getting into the actual soulbinds themselves. First up, we have Plague, Divisor, Merilith. Now, this one is actually going to be the strongest one out of all three of them. I will go over all of the abilities and let you know why, and then you can pretty much figure out why after we've summed up each one of these soulbinds. So going over the first one, Volatile Solvent. Using Fleshcraft with nearby corpses derives a benefit from a corpse, differing based on the creature's type. Now, this is the strongest one. It's the very first one you get, and it is the strongest one. And the reason why it's the strongest one when it comes to Feral Druids specifically, it's actually one of the reasons why it becomes very strong for several classes, but Feral Druids specifically, is that if you cast your Fleshcraft over a humanoid because it's dependent on creature type. If you cast it over a humanoid, you will get 342 mastery. And what that comes out to is just over 20% mastery. So it is strictly just a 20% gain of mastery across the board. And our mastery as Feral Druids increases the damage done by your cat form bleed abilities and finishing moves by whatever mastery you have. Baseline right now, I have 40% without having any buffs on, so no foods on, and then not having the Fleshcraft one active currently either. But when you do have that active, you get easily above 60%. I believe normally I'm sitting around 62% mastery, and that's pretty big. That's a lot of mastery, especially for all that increased damage. 60% increased damage to your finishers, because that includes Ferocious Bite, which is our biggest hitting single target ability, but it also is Primal Wrath, which is our biggest AoE finishing ability. And all of the bleeds from Primal Wrath and from Rake and Rip will also get this amplification from this ability. This one Soulbind ability is extremely strong. However, there are several drawbacks to this ability as well. Okay, the first one is that when you cast it over a humanoid, that's the first problem right there, is that you have to cast it over a dead humanoid. So you have to have that creature type there so that you can get that buff from them. So you're going to be saving your Fleshcraft Absorb only when you have a humanoid underneath you to make sure that you're getting that proc for the 342 mastery. There are other buffs that you can get. Mainly I wanted to focus in on the mastery one. You can get a 2% agility one, which isn't bad. The rest of them are more so utility ones, but the main focus is going to be that 342 mastery. 342 mastery, even if you look at some of the gear that I'm wearing right here, 190 item level, even if we go to the legendary 190 item level, it's 77 critical strike, 77 mastery. That's a legendary, and that's a legendary ring, which has increased stats as well. If you go over to something like wrist, 190 wrist right here, it has 26 haste. 26 haste, 38 versatility, compared to 342 mastery is a massive deal. Getting back to the impacts of this ability. So you have to have a humanoid. You have to save your ability for when a humanoid is dead, and then use this ability. As soon as you cast it, you don't have to have the full duration of the cast go off. As soon as you press your Fleshcraft, it will give you that buff automatically, so you don't actually have to stay and get the full channel of Fleshcraft. You can move on as soon as you press that button, and it will give you the buff. You can accumulate multiple different buffs from different spawned ads if you have different types all in the same section. If you have multiple humanoids, you will only get the one buff though. It lasts for 6 minutes. That's the other drawback to this ability as well. Fleshcraft is on a 2-minute cooldown. The ability, if you place it over a humanoid, the buff lasts for 6 minutes. And that's okay if you're doing certain dungeons. Several dungeons have a lot of humanoids in it inside the Shadowlands, and you can pretty much have that buff up 100% of the time, depending on the route that you're taking inside the dungeons. Most dungeons all have some form of humanoids. There are a few dungeons out there, though, that do have a little bit of a harder time, mainly like in Theater of Pain. I had a few difficulties where I was trying to find a humanoid at times because a lot of it's undead, or it's, ghosts, it's apparitions. So it's not the buffs that I wanted to get, but if you actually pathed it out correctly inside that dungeon, there are several humanoids still within that dungeon that you can utilize Fleshcraft on and keep it up continuously throughout the dungeon. However, there's another drawback to this ability as well. It is very strong on mastery, but that buff expires upon death. If you're thinking about this ability going into a raid boss, especially in Cathlanathria, you're going to be killing some vampires in there. They're humanoids. You're going to be able to use this ability and gain that 6-minute buff. However, when you're going into a boss fight and you die for the first time, especially on progress, and you go back into that fight, the horrible thing that's going to happen to you is you're going to lose that buff. And then those trash mobs aren't going to respawn. They don't respawn in dungeons or inside raids, so you're just not going to have that buff again if you have any kind of content that you have to repeat. And that is a very big drawback to this one ability. It looks really good when you can keep it up and you're not dying. However, as soon as you die, you lose that buff. It's only lasts for 6 minutes, and you use Fleshcraft over the humanoid's body in order to get that massive mastery proc. However, when testing and having this mastery proc up, it is very strong. It is very noticeable that you have that additional mastery. You could get out some very good AoE specifically with this up. That is by far the strongest ability. That's why we spent a little bit of time going over just that one ability. Now, the next ones here, you're still going to want your potency conduits. Our potencies are still very strong, so the Tiger's Fury 3% damage is still something we're going to select in here. And then going down the row, you have Ooze's Frictionless Coating. When reduced below 50% health, Ooze courses over you, granting you a shield for 20% of your maximum health for 10 seconds. May only occur once per 30 seconds. That's not bad for having as kind of a defensive. It doesn't give us any kind of actual damage output. It's pretty much the thing we took going down the line because we wanted that potency. Then we go down to this finesse one because we have to take it. I put front of the pack in there. Born Anew is also a very good one to place in here as well. Then coming down here, we have an option between these two. We have Kevin's Keyring, allows opening of locks that require up to 60 skill once every 24 hours. Each 1 second spent channeling Fleshcraft reduces Kevin's Keyring's cooldown by 60 minutes. And that's kind of cool. It gives you the rogue ability to open up lock boxes and stuff like that. So it gives you a little bit of utility that you can use. Not a huge thing, not a damage gain at all. You could also select Plague-born Cleansing Slime. Defeating enemies has a chance to deploy your Plague-born Cleansing Slime, which improves the remaining durability on your armor. A little bit of gold that you don't have to spend if you select this one instead of the other. Then jumping down here, you're going to take the double potency and then going down to the bottom for ultimate form. While channeling Fleshcraft, you are immune to crowd control. Finishing the full channel grants you another 4 seconds of crowd control immunity. This is huge for PvP, I would say. It's also something you could probably use inside Raid and Mythic Plus if you know that there's something coming that's going to crowd control you, and here you have an immunity against it. So you can utilize this one pretty decently to avoid some kind of incoming crowd control effects. It will need to be tested, obviously, especially in Raid, if it does negate certain boss mechanics that are trying to fear you away or stun you, silence you, so on. It should. Sometimes Raid boss mechanics work in a special way where you can't avoid them. But in Mythic Plus, this should stop you from getting any kind of crowd control effects that might end up happening. So this is the first soulbind that we have. Moving on to the second one, I don't have him unlocked yet. There's actually a bug inside the Covenant campaign that's not letting me progress further into him, but he's not really somebody I wanted to choose anyway, and we'll go over why right now. Coming down, this is actually one of the few soulbinds where you actually have an option here because it's not a potency conduit as your first conduit. It's a finesse or defensive. For Feral Druids kit, I would definitely go defensive because then you could have innate resolve, which is an increased 12% on your regrowth, which I think is fantastic. But going over the abilities, this first one right here, Emmy's Ambulatory Flesh. You may channel Fleshcraft while moving. Now this one's actually going to be pretty cool. Being able to just keep it going, like if you start casting it over a group, then you'll be able to get some of the benefits as you're moving with the rest of your group. Normally you want to channel the entire 4 seconds over a group of dead mobs so you get the full benefit from it, but sometimes you have to keep going, and this will give you an absorb no matter what if you're on the move. The other one is Emmy's Magnificent Skin. Adaptive Form increases your maximum health by 5% for 30 seconds. I would still go over here just for Innate Resolve or even Tough as Bark. More than likely Innate Resolve, just for that additional defensive capabilities. Then we have a potency, and you'll place in one of the main potency ones. Carnivorous Instincts or Taste for Blood for sure will go inside these first couple of potency ones that we have. After this potency, you have another split decision that you can make. Cartilaneous Legs. After taking falling damage, the health loss becomes a shield lasting 30 seconds. Now this one sounds like if you take fall damage you get a shield, but you could actually use this in kind of like in niche scenarios, and I'm kind of wondering how Mythic Plus, if they end up taking something like this, would use it, because if you purposely took that fall damage and gained the shield, the healer healed you up real quick and you had the shield going into a boss fight, that might be something kind of funny to do, but not that great for Feral Druid. Not bad, not that great. We take reduced fall damage anyway from being in cat form, so you probably want to get a big one from this anyway unless you intended to do that. The other one that you can choose is Hearth Kidney Stone. You may attune your Hearth Kidney Stone to any resting location and return to it. 24-hour cooldown, reduced by 5 minutes every killing blow. It's still very nice to have a Hearthstone that you can place it somewhere. You can just have another teleport elsewhere. After that, you have another potency, so you're going to end up putting Carnivorous Instincts or Taste for Blood. You're going to have those two jumping into these first two slots. After that, you're going to jump over here. You still want the potency ones. There is one thing that I have to go over, and that's Evolve Swarm isn't really something that's strong enough because the adaptive swarm ability isn't as strong as some of the potencies that we have, and its utilization is very minor because there's no AoE component to it, so you're using it single target only, and it has a very small damage window within the single targets as well. So using Evolve Swarm and Adaptive Swarm is very low damage potential right now, so you actually wouldn't use that, or in my opinion, you wouldn't use Evolve Swarm, you'd use something else. Going back to our Plague Divisor Marilith, I actually was using Incessant Hunter, which rip damage has a 10% chance to grant 3 energy, and it was feeding me back some energy, especially in dungeons on AoE packs. Sudden Death will probably end up taking that spot if we end up having to use this Conduit once we get rank up of Sudden Death, so the proc rate actually comes out better. Coming down here, more than likely Incessant Hunter is a better potency one to use than Evolved Swarm. It's only 6% more, and it's only 6% more while you have Adaptive Swarm up, and it's only up for those 12 seconds. You could use a potency. You can absolutely just ignore the third potency since we're not using Evolved Swarm, and maybe you don't want to have Incessant Hunter or Sudden Ambush because you don't need the energy, or you don't want the low chance of getting the Sudden Ambush proc, and you could absolutely place in other Finesse or Endurance conduits if you feel like they would be strong enough for you. They're not going to give you any throughput for damage, but you could place them in there because you have the option to do so with not having another potency conduit that's extremely viable to place in there. The last one on here is Embody the Construct. After using 60 spells or ability, your next Fleshcraft will deal 2,683 shadow damage to up to 5 nearby enemies over the duration, and heal up to 5 nearby allies for 4,024. This is one of the few damaging abilities we actually have throughout all these soulbinds. It does seem like the burst damage would be nice going into an AoE pack. The drawbacks to it though is that then you're using Fleshcraft not over bodies, but you're using it to utilize as AoE or healing. And then the other thing is that after using 60 spells or abilities, your next Fleshcraft, so you can actually time it because you'll be using your cooldown when you want to. You just have to do 60 spells before your Fleshcraft, which 60 spells is not a lot at all, especially for Feral Druids. We can do a lot of that very, very quickly. So every 2 minutes you can utilize this kind of little burst damage, which is it's not bad. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it's definitely not bad. It gives you that little bit of boost in there. But from this entire tree, the only big damaging things that you can really get is from this last one that you get, and that kind of puts a drawback to the entire soulbind itself. And that's pretty much it for the soulbind. So moving on to the next one, we have Bonesmith Hymir. And then going over his abilities, you're still going to want to try to take the potency paths, but like I said, there's one potency, this one actually, the one that I have socked in there. I don't feel it's very strong because I don't believe the ability itself is very strong, and we'll go over why here shortly after the soulbinds. So you can absolutely choose this path and go down this way, and that way you don't need this additional potency slot. So this one right here is Serrated Spalders. Inflicts 537 shadow damage to your attackers over 5 seconds when hit at melee range. Now this is definitely a tank thing because you're getting damage by them hitting you. It's like thorns. So this could be okay for PvP. Definitely okay for solo content, not really great for any PvE content because you should not be tanking. You should not be taking hits from anything, so you're not going to be getting a lot of that damage. And that's another one of the few damaging things that these soulbinds offer, and it's mainly for a tank. But this one over here, Resourceful Fleshcrafting, defeating an enemy reduces Fleshcraft's cooldown by 1 second. That can be pretty nice when you're going into a dungeon because then you can actually get more Fleshcrafts out for survivability purposes. After that, you have the two potencies. I would definitely put Carnivorous Instincts and then Taste for Blood as two of the mandatory, I would say, almost conduits for Feral Druids. So after that, we have Hymir's Arsenal, Gore Stompers, damaging or healing a target below 35% grants you 25% increased movement speed after you start moving. May only use once per minute. Not bad. Gives you a little speed while you're damaging something that's low. That's fine. There's a lot of these speed enhancement things going on. Jumping down here, you're going to have Taste for Blood or any other potency conduit that you want to place in there. Right below this one, we get a automatic defensive one. I put Innate Resolve in there because I think it's one of the best defensive ones you can get as a Feral Druid because now we have free regrowths. Before we go any further in this one though, jumping down this other side here, if If we wanted to put both of our potencies in these two, so have Carnivorous Instincts and then put Taste for Blood up here and go this way, you could for a damage gain, because Hymir's arsenal of Marled Gemstones, after landing 10 critical strikes, you gain 20% increased chance to critically strike for 20 seconds. May only occur once per 60 seconds. 10 crits and you get 20% increased crit for 20 seconds. That's actually pretty darn good, especially since it procs multiple times and it's not just the first 10 seconds of battle or 10 seconds that you're fighting mob if you hit them first, like First Strike does for the Night Fae one. This is actually pretty decent for pure throughput with crit. I think it's one of the stronger ones you could take if the pathing allows for you to actually do that in order to optimize this soulbind. I don't think this soulbind is going to be one that's going to be selected for Feral Druids just because we don't optimize a lot of our abilities by selecting this one. The crit is very big, especially at the start of the expansion, because we are very crit deprived. Going with the mastery build because of Adaptive Swarm's capability of enhancing our bleeds, and we want to enhance our bleeds with mastery so that they do even more damage. That going for crit here to kind of counteract some of the lack of crit that we have is probably not a bad idea in some situations. I don't believe it's the greatest soulbind ability that we could take, but it's definitely not bad. So going back down here, I chose Innate Resolve. And then you have two abilities that you can choose between. You have Rudeforged Spurs. Mounted movement speed is increased by 5%. If attacked while mounted, mounted movement speed is increased by an additional 10% for 5 seconds. Then you have Bonesmith's Satchel. You have a chance to obtain a satchel of the Bonesmith's preferred ore and gems when you kill an enemy that yields experience or honor. You can have a chance of just getting some passive profession materials, which is never bad. The last one here, Forgebone Reveries. Upon death, your armor continues to fight, allowing you to fight for an additional 10 seconds. During this time, your damage and healing done is reduced by 50% and you cannot receive healing. So this is just kind of like a semi keeping you alive type deal for the next 10 seconds. Instead, you'll just be doing 50% less damage. You won't be able to get heals and you'll die pretty quickly. I don't actually like this at all. I think it's actually more inconvenient than anything, especially in dungeon groups or in raid groups, because if you end up dying for whatever reason, somebody having to wait for you to actually die from your reanimated form in order to battle res you so you can actually do damage and continue with the fight, I think it's kind of an annoyance more than anything. It's not an actual cheat death mechanic like the pod is for Night Fae, because the pod, at least you can get healed up from it and survive from it. This one right here, you're dead, you just come back as a reanimated corpse, and you can damage for a little bit of time until you just flat out die, and then they can battle res you. So I don't particularly like this one. So inside this soulbind itself, there's not a lot of damaging potential inside it. There's hardly anything that actually gives you any real want as a Feral Druid to do it, besides this one ability giving you that amount of crit is very good, having that amount of crit, but that's the only thing of value that this entire Conduit gives you. The Plague Divisor is the first one that you get, and it's by far the strongest soulbind out of the three in my opinion, mainly because Volatile Solvent is very big buff, especially to mastery. It's the go-to reason and the only reason currently why Feral Druid, I believe, would ever pick going to the Malddraxxus, NecroLords, all that deal. The abilities themselves that we get with Adaptive Swarm and Fleshcraft are not really all that great or strong for a damage profile from a Feral Druid currently, but this one ability right here kind of drives it home for a potential that this might be strong. I don't actually think it's going to be all that great though, because of the hindrances that we talked about previously with Volatile Solvent. It having to have a humanoid, making sure that you're using it on that. It only has a 6-minute duration and it expires upon death. All of those are really counterplayed to utilizing this ability appropriately, especially doing higher end content, progressing in dungeons, progressing in Mythic Plus, progressing in raids. All of those are content that most people die in several times until we get it on farm, and definitely will at the beginning of the expansion. Even though this is very strong to select as a very first one, because it is your very first one you will get anyway if you go Malddraxxus, it's still not going to be something I think will be very strong later on. Alright, now that we've finished going over all of the soulbinds and the one specific conduit that the Malddraxxus give us, we're going to start talking about more in depth on the ability itself. So Adaptive Swarm as an ability for Feral Druids, it doesn't really play into the way Feral Druid plays currently. It would have played great in the previous spinning plates build that we had, where we were very heavy on single target with our bleeds specifically, because our damage profile was just bleeds. You know, you'd have Savage Word, you have Lunar Inspiration, you'd have Rake, Rip, and Thrash doing a massive amount of the damage on single target, and Ferocious Bite wouldn't come into play until the execute phase. That's not the case anymore. It's actually the tables have been completely turned around with it, where single target is actually wholly dependent on direct damage from Ferocious Bite and from Shred, which are our two highest damaging abilities that we get on single target. And then Rake and Rip and Thrash are pretty much buffs or modifiers to that capability, mainly because Taste for Blood gets enhanced by us having those 3 bleeds up there. And if we take Blood Talons, Thrash will also come into play on single target, so that you can make sure you have 3 combo point generating abilities within 4 seconds to proc a Blood Talons. But past that, Rip itself doesn't do a whole lot of damage, and that's why you take Sabretooth as a talent, because it refreshes Rip and does 20% increased damage to Ferocious Bite. That way you can keep it up without having to continuously use all 5 combo points or every other combo point finisher to keep it refreshed and up on the target. The bleeds are not very strong. They are decently strong when you go into an AoE environment, but we're talking about purely single target, because Adaptive Swarm is mainly a purely single target ability. You cast it on your target, it lasts for 12 seconds on your target, increasing the amount of periodic effects on them by 20%, and puts a small shadow dot on the target. Then it'll jump back to you, or to a friendly target. It's actually not specifically you, it's just to a friendly target. It will heal them for the next 12 seconds, and then it'll jump to an enemy target again. Not your target that you first put it on, it can go to any enemy target. So the only AoE capability of this ability is that it might have an RNG chance to go from your main target to a friendly target to a different target, and put the dot on a different target, and enhance, if you have any kind of spread cleave on the secondary target, it'll enhance the bleeds on the secondary target as well. And then you can put up a new one on your main target and have it rolling for one 12-second increment on both of them if the RNG allowed for it. That's one of the big problems with this, is that it doesn't have any actual on-demand AoE components to it whatsoever. Any AoE that you might be able to get from it potentially is purely all RNG, and it's not really something you can capitalize on all that much. This ability can have an extremely high uptime, but you also have to realize that half of the uptime is doing healing and not doing damage. And when it jumps back to a target, it's actually harder to figure out if you want to optimize it being on another target with some bleed damage, or if you're just going to let it do its thing and you're going to prioritize your single target, which is what I would say if you're trying to optimize it, you would. Every 25 seconds, you can place it back up on your main target, enhancing your bleeds on your main target. And you can make sure you keep all of them up there with Rake, Thrash, and Rip on your main target, and then you throw Adaptive Swarm on it as soon as you have those up, and it'll make all of those do 20% increased damage for 12 seconds. So whatever damage that those 3 bleeds will do while ticking down, or even Lunar Inspiration if you do end up taking that, it'll do all of that damage within 12 seconds, have 20% increased damage on them. The bigger problem with single target is what our damage profile as Feral Druids are, which we just talked about briefly. And that is that our single target damage is not coming from our bleeds. And so placing this up there, when I was doing it in dungeons, the bosses were dying relatively fast. But when I placed it up there in dungeons, this ability by itself was doing about 2 to 3 max % of damage, which almost made it not worthwhile casting on single target, and is absolutely not worth casting on AoE. It's a waste of a GCD on AoE, because it doesn't do enough damage for one target to be useful enough to cast it. So this ability right here, because it only does 2 to 3% on the single targets that I was testing, it's not strong enough to enhance from your Evolved Swarm conduit that you get from being in the Malddraxxus. It's the Covenant-specific conduit. It's not worth taking that. Instead, put a different potency one in there. Put Sudden Ambush or put Incessant Hunter in there, because those are definitely going to give you more bang for your buck than 6% on an ability that's already doing very insignificant damage for Druid profile. The only reason right now to go to the Malddraxxus as a Feral Druid is because of the very first conduit ability, Volatile Solvent, which gives you 342 mastery, which is a massive amount of mastery, almost a ridiculous amount of mastery right off the get-go at the beginning of the expansion. Adaptive Swarm needs some massive changes in my opinion in order to make it viable in pretty much all content. I have heard that there are several PvP frills that are talking about this being okay. I personally wouldn't advise it over the other abilities that Feral Druids will have in their kit, mainly because it's only going to do that increased damage for your bleeds, so you might have like a rock comp or something like that and place it on there and help out with it, but it doesn't do any kind of burst damage. It does give you a little bit of off healing, but if you place it on an enemy and the enemy LOSs you around a pillar, the moment that ticks off of that enemy, it just disappears. You lose any stacks that you have. And that's another drawback to Adaptive Swarm, is that not just in PvP, but any content, if you place it on an enemy and you have to move away and your raid has to move away from the enemy that you place it on, if there's nobody in range of receiving the jump, it will just disappear and you won't get the jumps from it. If you kill something, it will jump faster to back to you to a friendly target. So if you place it on a target and the target dies within 3 to 5 seconds, it will jump back to you and start its healing for 12 seconds, and that's fine, but it's just not valuable from a damage from a GCD. It's on the GCD, which actually makes it feel bad because it's not an important button to press, which a lot of that needs to be changed. There definitely needs some redesign for it. I don't really see any form of druid where it's going to be that great, but mainly for Feral Druids, for this guide, I would not recommend Malddraxxus purely because of this ability. Fleshcraft is an alright ability for defensive. Adaptive Swarm, not that great. It needs to have some kind of AoE component. Even if it's just a small cleave, you can shoot it on 3 targets if you take a conduit that allows you to place it on 3 different targets. Also, the damage needs to be ramped up. There's a lot of things that could be done to this to make it better. On a very long raid boss fight, this could test to be a little bit better. I definitely do not think that it's going to come ahead from where some of the other abilities are, but you could have up to about 50 to 60% uptime of pure damage. You can have this have an uptime of 96+ percent uptime, but half of that uptime, once again, is it healing targets and not damaging targets. But you can have somewhere around 50 to 60% uptime of it damaging a target and having that dot up on the target, but then making sure that you have to have your bleeds up on that target whenever it does jump back up on to your main target. So the damage potential of 20% increase from your bleeds could come into play with something like that, but the damage profile from Feral Druids is just our bleeds are not very strong at all, single target. Spread cleave, once again, our bleeds start coming into play a little bit more, but Ferocious Bite's still going to outbeat it, even on like a 2-target scenario. Also, on that note, is that if you have it on a target and it jumps to you and then it jumps to a secondary target, or if it jumps back to the target that you're going to place your next stack on, it'll just increase the stacks and stack up. So you get 3 stacks baseline. When it jumps back to the target, for that 3rd tick, you will be able to press the ability again and throw it back on the target, and it'll get 4 jumps instead of 3 jumps, but it won't do increased damage, and it doesn't spread at all. So you can have increased stacks. If you have 2 targets that are up 100% of the time, and you're equally damaging both of them, you can have stacks eventually on both of them and keep refreshing both of those stacks. I got to the point on 2-target cleave where I had 3 stacks on each target, and I was able to keep them rolling up because they would periodically bounce back from a friendly target and then bounce back onto each other, and then I would be able to refresh whichever one of the 2 was at the lowest stacks, so that by the time the next one needed to be refreshed, I was able to refresh it before it fell off the target again. And so you are able to keep it up on 2 targets if they're alive for a very long time, and you want to try to keep your bleed spread across those 2 targets and enhance it by Adaptive Swarm. But Adaptive Swarm, just from a playstyle, it's not a strong ability. You don't feel the damage increase to your bleeds. The only thing that I've felt the damage increase or the playability from is from the 1 Soulbind that offers you a massive amount of mastery. So I know I haven't given that great of a view on Adaptive Swarm itself. Fleshcraft is an alright ability. Adaptive Swarm, I'm not a fan of it at all. The Soulbind ability I am a fan of, but I do want to also continue into this video with the deep dive of what this ability does with some of the legendaries and some of the issues that I have with some of the legendaries and its counter synergy with Adaptive Swarm. I have gone over all of these legendaries inside the Night Fae ability for each one of them. There's only a few of them that I want to talk about with this ability specifically and within Malddraxxus. Not just the ability of Adaptive Swarm, but within Malddraxxus itself, because that massive mastery buff that we get can also also affect several of these legendaries and how they work for us. So the one that I want to bring up is Circle of Life and Death. Your damage over time effects deal their damage in 25% less time, and your healing over time effects in 15% less time. Now, the problem with this and its counter synergy, because this is the legendary that has counter synergy with Adaptive Swarm, is that it makes Adaptive Swarm faster as well. So it's only a 12-second damaging ability when you place it on a target, and when you place this on it, it does its ticking and its own dot in 25% less time. And the problem with that, because normally you'd think that a dot doing its damage faster is great, is that the 20% increased effects that it gives your bleeds is going to be reduced then. So you're going to have less time to do those bleeds in there. Now, you are doing 25%, your other bleeds are going to be doing 25% less time with this as well. But your uptime on a boss or on whatever you're placing Adaptive Swarm on is going to be lessened significantly, but it should still do the same amount of damage that it was doing previously. It's just you're going to have it off of the target much more often, and it's going to jump to you and then jump back to the target and do its decreased value again. So that's the counterplay that it really has with Circle of Life and Death. If they kept the same damage with it, if they just made it so that Circle of Life and Death doesn't affect it, it would actually make it stronger, just because you'd be able to have Circle of Life and Death apply to your bleeds, which will make your bleeds tick faster within the 12 seconds amplification for 20% increased damage done that Adaptive Swarm does, which would actually make Adaptive Swarm stronger than what it already is. So the next one I wanted to go over for Malddraxxus is not really Adaptive Swarm. Adaptive Swarm doesn't have any play into this, but the mastery does, because your finish moves and your bleeds getting that extra 20% increased mastery from utilizing the Soulbind. Apex Predator's Carving is a finishing move that will be granted that additional mastery damage every time it procs. And not only that, in order to proc Apex Predator's Carving, you're going to be putting out a ton of bleeds with Primal Wrath to proc up this Apex Predator Carving Ferocious Bite. This Ferocious Bite gives you a 100% increase or full damage profile of a Ferocious Bite. It gives you a Ferocious Bite as if you had full combo points and full energy, and it's free. And it synergizes well with Soul of the Forest because it gives us the energy back from utilizing it as if it was a full combo point ability as well. So there is some good synergies with that and with the mastery, because then the mastery is just going to make this ability every time it procs do 20% increased damage. So there is some decent synergy with that amount of mastery you can get from the Malddraxxus one with this one. There is still, obviously, you have to make sure that you get this on enough targets to proc it. It is only a 4% chance to proc, but it is still very nice. Now, testing wise, with the amount of mastery that you have, I still like playing with Cat Eye Curio. I think that's one of the three that I've just mentioned are the strongest legendaries that we have, and I definitely think Cat Eye Curio makes a nice fluid rotation for us that allows you to put out more of those high damaging bleeds with the increased mastery, and get out even more of those Ferocious Bites while you're having your bleeds on your targets, which then your Ferocious Bites will just have that increased mastery damage as well. So the legendaries will be amplified by the mastery buff you get from Malddraxxus, from the Soulbind specifically, but none of these are really going to be amplified all that much from Adaptive Swarm itself, which is really bad to say. I really do hope that they do some kind of change to Adaptive Swarm to make Malddraxxus even somewhat of a thought for taking. There are people that have highly rated Adaptive Swarm, and through my testing with it, it just does not compare with any of the other covenants. It is by far the last covenant that I would rank throughout all the covenants. Mainly the ability of the Malddraxxus is what I would rank low. The mastery proc, if that stays the same, that is a decent way to get back into Malddraxxus, but I definitely think that the other covenants offer a better synergy and better gameplay through just their main ability actually doing something that's worthwhile for our class. Alright, so my conclusion on Malddraxxus Feral Druid. If you stay tuned for this long into the video, you know that my opinion on Adaptive Swarm is not the greatest. I don't think it's a good ability for Feral Druids. I don't think it's going to be something that we're going to want further down the line, just because our damage profile is not about bleeds for PvE and single target, and the ability is mainly single target at its core, and it doesn't affect or benefit our main single target damaging ability, which is Ferocious Bite and Shred. With no AoE component to Adaptive Swarm, there's a big problem there as well. It has some counter synergies with some of the legendaries that we have, and it doesn't play a big role in pretty much any aspect of the gameplay. So I do hope that they do some changes to this. I really would like to see it being able to do some conduit that would, instead of it just increasing the periodic damage it does, maybe it allows it to spread to some targets. That way you can increase it, especially if they put it to where it could spread to 5 targets. Even if they capped it at that 5 targets and you were still able to Primal Wrath all targets, then at least 5 of your Primal Wrath targets would receive that increased damage during AoE. That could be a very good way to help utilize this ability, or try to make it worthwhile while inside an AoE environment, but currently it's just not worth the GCD in my opinion to cast while using it. The Malddraxxus Covenant is a very cool covenant. I really like their back piece. As you can see, their back piece is pretty awesome. It moves and everything. It's these bone wings. I thought it was pretty awesome. I like their weapon as well. I do like the other gear and the aesthetic of it as well, but the only thing that Malddraxxus damage-wise really gives druids is the one soulbind ability from your first soulbind that you can utilize to get 342 mastery. You can use it also to get 2% agility from beasts and a couple other defensive utility type buffs, but nothing that's going to outdo the amount of mastery that you get. All it would take for us to never think twice about ever coming to Malddraxxus is for Blizzard to nerf that one soulbind ability, and they might, because there's other classes that their NecroLord ability, their Malddraxxus ability, is very, very good for their class, and them taking that increased mastery is very strong for them as well. So instead of nerfing their class ability, they might just nerf that soulbind ability, and then if they indirectly nerf it for other classes, then Feral is going to get the bad end of the stick on that, and this covenant will probably never be used for Feral Druids, in my opinion. I don't like the ability. I don't like the way it plays. I don't think it's nearly strong enough. It needs to have some kind of AoE component. It needs to be able to blend in well with some of our other abilities. If they bring back the Spinning Plates build and retune our class, get rid of Primal Wrath and get rid of Sabertooth and rework them into something different, or even if Primal Wrath becomes a bleed that's not Rip, so they can buff Rip up instead, and Sabertooth would have to not be there for single target purposes. They would have to retune Rip and Ferocious Bite to pretty much switch places so that you don't have Ferocious Bite coming into big play on that, and Ferocious Bite can go back to being an execute ability, which I believe is where it should have been and should have stayed. But if they don't ever do that, this ability I don't think is going to be that big. It would have been really big back in the day. That's my overall look on the Malddraxxus Feral Druids. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for staying in tune. Thank you to all the people that gave me comments about my previous video on the Night Fae and the deep dive into it. I am working on making these videos better, and the next one up is going to be Venthyr. If you like this video and you like the content that I'm doing, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can also find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/sageshifter, and you can also find me on Twitter and on Instagram at sageshifter. All the links for those will be inside the description below. The timestamps will be in the description below, and a link to the Night Fae video will also be here as well. If there's anything that I missed on potentials for Adaptive Swarm specifically, because I don't see a very big value in it, please let me know so that I can test it out and find out what it is here for, what it can be used for. If you have any other questions about Feral Druids, please let me know. If there's anything I missed for Malddraxxus, please let me know. Thank you all very much for the support, and I will see you again next time.